The Vanishing Road. Hello, this is Midnight Dark. Subscribe us for more videos. Route 285 between Roswell and Artesia, New Mexico. 57 miles of straight highway through absolute nothing. But according to 17 different witnesses over the past 5 years, sometimes those 57 miles become something else entirely. Sometimes they become a road that leads nowhere anyone has ever been. And sometimes, the people who take that wrong turn don't come back the same. This is the story of Detective Maria Santos and the case that made her question everything she thought she knew about reality. Detective Maria Santos had seen enough missing persons cases to know that people disappeared for ordinary reasons. Domestic violence, financial problems, mental health crises, tragic, but explicable. What she never encountered was an entire family vanishing from a straight stretch of highway with no side roads for 30 miles in either direction. Until the Hendricks case. David and Jennifer Hendricks, along with their 2 teenage daughters, had been driving from Albuquerque to their vacation rental in Ruidoso. It should have been a routine trip on well-traveled highways. Their last confirmed sighting was at a gas station in Roswell, where security cameras showed them fueling up and buying snacks at 3:47 p.m. on a cloudless Saturday afternoon. They never reached their destination. Their rental car was found 3 days later by a highway patrol officer, parked on the shoulder of Route 285 exactly 41 miles south of Roswell. The vehicle was undamaged, the engine was still warm, and all personal belongings were intact. But the family was nowhere to be found. More disturbing were the details that emerged during the investigation. The car's GPS showed that the family had been driving in circles for over 6 hours, following a route that according to all available maps was impossible. The device recorded them making turns and traveling on roads that didn't exist, covering over 400 miles without ever leaving the 57-mile stretch between Roswell and Artesia. Maria had requested the case specifically because of her background in desert search and rescue. She knew the terrain, understood how the harsh environment could disorient travelers, and had connections with local search teams who could cover ground that might hide evidence of foul play or accident. What she discovered challenged every assumption she'd made about the nature of reality itself. The first clue came from interviewing other travelers who had used Route 285 around the time of the Hendricks disappearance. Most had nothing unusual to report, but 3 separate witnesses described experiencing brief moments of disorientation while driving the same stretch of highway. Rebecca Torres, a nurse driving home from a late shift, reported that her usual 40-minute commute had somehow taken 3 hours, though she couldn't account for the missing time. Her car's odometer showed she'd driven 180 miles, but she had no memory of stopping or deviating from her normal route. James Williamson, a truck driver with 30 years of experience, described taking what he thought was a detour around construction that led him through a landscape he'd never seen before, rolling hills covered in vegetation that shouldn't exist in the Chihuahuan Desert. When he finally returned to Route 285, his GPS showed he'd never left the highway. Most intriguingly, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geologist from the University of New Mexico, reported collecting soil samples from what she believed was a previously unknown geological formation. When she analyzed the samples in her lab, she found mineral compositions that didn't match anything in North America, or anywhere else on Earth. Maria began spending long hours driving Route 285, trying to understand how a straight highway could become a maze that trapped travelers. She studied weather patterns, geological surveys, and even electromagnetic anomaly reports, looking for any scientific explanation for the reported incidents. On her 7th trip along the highway, she experienced it herself. It happened at sunset, when the desert light creates optical illusions that can fool even experienced drivers. Maria was maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour, her attention focused on the unchanging landscape of creosote bushes and distant mountains. She blinked, and when her eyes opened, everything had changed. The road was still beneath her tires, but it was no longer Route 285. The asphalt was older, cracked and patched with materials that looked decades out of date. The landscape on either side had transformed from desert scrubland to something that resembled the American Midwest, rolling grasslands stretching to a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. Maria's first instinct was to pull over and orient herself, but there was no shoulder. The road now existed as a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting through terrain that showed no signs of human habitation. No power lines, no fence posts, no tire tracks besides her own. Her radio crackled with static when she tried to call for backup. Her GPS showed her position as a blank area with no roads, no landmarks, and coordinates that placed her somewhere in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. Her cell phone displayed no signal bars and a timestamp that was wrong by several hours. For the first time in her 15-year career in law enforcement, Maria Santos was genuinely terrified. The road ahead curved gently to the right, though she distinctly remembered Route 285 being perfectly straight for dozens of miles. As she followed the curve, she saw something that made her slam on the brakes: another car, parked in the middle of the road about a quarter-mile ahead. It was a blue sedan that matched the description of the Hendricks rental. Maria approached cautiously, her service weapon drawn but not aimed. The car appeared to have been abandoned recently, the engine was still ticking as it cooled, and the keys were in the ignition. But like the original crime scene, there was no sign of the occupants. What there was, scattered around the vehicle, were dozens of photographs. Polaroid pictures, the kind that hadn't been commonly used in decades, showing the Hendricks family in locations that Maria didn't recognize. Desert landscapes, but wrong somehow, the colors too vivid, the rock formations too geometric, the sky the wrong shade of blue. In the photos, the family appeared happy but confused, as if they were tourists in a place they hadn't expected to visit. The final photo in the sequence showed all four family members standing beside their car, smiling and waving at the camera. But behind them, barely visible in the background, was a figure that made Maria's blood freeze. Tall and thin, wearing clothes that seemed to shift and blur in the photograph, the figure had no discernible face but was clearly watching the family with inhuman patience. Maria heard footsteps on the asphalt behind her. She spun around, weapon raised, but saw only empty road stretching back the way she'd come. The footsteps continued, steady and purposeful, but their source remained invisible. Maria's training told her to take cover and call for backup, but her radio produced only static and her backup was in a world that might no longer exist. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her. "You're looking for them," a voice said, though Maria could see no speaker. The words seemed to come from the air itself, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers talking in perfect unison. "Where are they?" Maria demanded, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Where they chose to be," the voice replied. "Where everyone eventually chooses to be, when they understand what's being offered." Maria felt a pressure in her mind, gentle but insistent, like fingers probing the edges of her thoughts. Images began to form, not visual exactly, but concepts that her brain struggled to process. She saw roads that existed in the spaces between destinations, connecting places that were never meant to be connected. She understood that Route 285 was just one point of access to a network of impossible highways that spanned dimensions human geography had never mapped. "The family," she managed to say through the mental intrusion. "What happened to them?" "They learned to see the real roads," the voice explained. "The ones that lead to places your kind have forgotten how to reach. They're happier now, exploring territories that don't appear on your limited maps." More images flooded Maria's consciousness. She saw the Hendricks family walking through landscapes of impossible beauty, forests of crystalline trees, deserts where the sand was made of ground starlight, cities built from music and inhabited by beings of living mathematics. In every image, they appeared content, as if they'd found something they hadn't known they were looking for. You could join them, the voice suggested. You could see what lies beyond the boundaries your species has accepted. All you have to do is keep driving. Maria felt the temptation like a physical force. The mundane world she'd left behind seemed suddenly small and colorless compared to the infinite possibilities the voice was showing her. Her life as a small-town detective, dealing with domestic disputes and petty crimes, felt meaningless against the backdrop of cosmic highways and interdimensional travel. But something deeper in her mind rebelled against the seduction. Her training, her oath, her fundamental sense of duty to the people she'd sworn to protect, all of it coalesced into a core of resistance that the alien influence couldn't penetrate. "No," she said firmly. "I need to go back." The presence in her mind withdrew, and Maria sensed something like disappointment in the air around her. "You change your mind," the voice predicted. "They all do, eventually. The road will call to you again, and next time you'll be ready to listen." The world blurred around Maria like a photograph going out of focus. When her vision cleared, she was back on the familiar Route 285, her patrol car parked on the shoulder exactly where she'd been when the experience began. The sun was in the same position, her radio was working normally, and her GPS showed her correct location. But in her hand was a Polaroid photograph that hadn't been there before. It showed Maria herself, standing beside her patrol car on the impossible road. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, was the tall, thin figure she'd seen in the Hendrix photos. And in the foreground, scattered around her feet, were dozens more photographs, images of every person who had ever vanished from Route 285, all of them smiling and happy in landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth. Maria drove back to town in silence, her mind struggling to process what she'd experienced. She filed her official report as an equipment malfunction and disorientation due to heat exhaustion. But privately, she began researching similar disappearances along isolated highways across the American Southwest. What she found terrified her. Route 285 was just one of dozens of roads where people regularly vanished under impossible circumstances. Highway 50 in Nevada, Route 6 in Utah, Interstate 40 through Arizona, all had clusters of unexplained disappearances that followed the same pattern. Families and individuals who simply ceased to exist while traveling straight stretches of highway with no possible detours. More disturbing still, Maria discovered that some of the missing people had been found, but not where they disappeared. They turned up in other states, sometimes thousands of miles away, with no memory of how they traveled such distances. When questioned, they all reported the same thing: they'd taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere wonderful. And they all expressed a desire to return. Maria became obsessed with the cases, spending her off-duty hours interviewing witnesses and mapping disappearance patterns. She developed a theory that certain geographical locations serve as access points to what she privately called the other road, a transportation network that existed parallel to our own reality. Her superiors became concerned about her fixation on the case, and she was eventually transferred to a desk job in Albuquerque. But Maria continued her research, now convinced that something was actively recruiting humans for purposes she couldn't begin to understand. The truth came to her in dreams. Night after night, Maria found herself walking along impossible highways that connected worlds beyond imagination. In these dreams, she encountered the missing people she'd been searching for. They were all happy, all eager to share their experiences of traveling between dimensions and exploring realities that existed beyond the limited perception of ordinary human consciousness. But she also began to understand the price of such revelations. Each person who joined the travelers became a little less human. Their empathy for people who remained in the original world faded, replaced by an alien perspective that saw humanity as a species trapped by its own limited perception. They became recruiters, using their human appearance to lure others onto the roads that led away from Earth. The Hendricks family had become such recruiters. In her dreams, Maria saw them at various highway rest stops and gas stations, subtly encouraging other travelers to explore scenic routes that didn't appear on conventional maps. Their targets were always people who seemed dissatisfied with their lives, who might be tempted by promises of adventure and discovery. Maria realized that her experience on Route 285 had been a recruitment attempt. The entity that had contacted her wasn't trying to harm her, it was trying to save her from what it perceived as a limited, colorless existence. From its perspective, humans were prisoners of their own reality, and the disappearances were actually liberations. But Maria also understood that accepting such liberation meant abandoning everyone she'd sworn to protect. The missing people weren't victims in the traditional sense, but they'd been transformed into something that could no longer feel genuine connection to unenlightened humanity. She made a decision that she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. Using her research and her contacts in law enforcement, Maria began warning people about the dangerous roads. She couldn't explain the real nature of the threat without sounding insane, so she created false stories about drug cartels and human traffickers using remote highways to ambush travelers. Her warnings were effective, travel along the identified routes decreased significantly, and the number of disappearances dropped accordingly. But Maria knew it was only a temporary solution. The other road existed outside of time and geography, and it would find new access points as soon as the old ones became too well guarded. More troubling still, Maria began receiving visits from some of the people she'd helped save. They thanked her for her warnings, but their gratitude was tinged with resentment. They spoke of dreams about roads that led to wonders beyond imagination, and several confessed that they sometimes drove the dangerous highways hoping to experience what they'd been denied. Maria realized that her intervention had created a different kind of victim, people who'd been exposed to the possibility of transcendence but denied the opportunity to embrace it. They remained in the ordinary world, but part of them would forever yearn for the impossible roads they'd glimpsed in dreams. The final entry in Maria's private journal, found after her own disappearance 6 months later, read, "I understand now why the others chose to leave. It's not about escaping reality, it's about expanding it. The road doesn't take people away from their lives. It shows them that their lives could be so much more than they ever imagined. I've spent months trying to protect people from a gift I was too afraid to accept myself. But the dreams won't stop, and I can't unsee what I've seen. The other road isn't a threat to humanity. It's an invitation to become something greater. Maybe some invitations are too important to refuse." Maria's patrol car was found on Route 285, exactly where the Hendricks vehicle had been discovered. Like all the others, she'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind only questions and a growing suspicion that the missing people hadn't been taken against their will. The road still calls to travelers who drive the empty highways of the American Southwest. It whispers promises of adventure and discovery to those who feel trapped by the limitations of ordinary existence. And sometimes, when conditions are right and the barriers between worlds grow thin, people answer that call. They don't disappear. They graduate. And if you ever find yourself driving alone on a straight highway that seems to go on forever, pay attention to the road signs. If they start showing destinations you've never heard of, or if your GPS begins displaying routes that shouldn't exist, you have a choice to make. You can turn back to the world you know, with all its familiar disappointments and limitations. Or you can keep driving and discover what lies beyond the horizon of human perception. But remember, once you see the other road, you can never completely forget it. And it will never stop calling your name. Route 285 is still open to traffic. The disappearances have stopped, but only because fewer people drive that lonely stretch of highway. The road is still there, waiting patiently for travelers who are ready to see beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. The question isn't whether you encounter the other road. The question is whether you have the courage to follow it when it finally reveals itself to you. Engine fades into distance.